Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Now, the day 2 of Lent. Today's Thursday. We're reading the 40 chapters of Exodus during the 40 days of Lent. We left off concluding with chapter number 1. There, a continuous stream through the Old Testament that even reaches into the New Testament is this juxtaposition between God's kingdom and his covenant people to the powers on earth, and in this case it is Egypt. Throughout the book of Genesis, it sets up this narration of when Abraham goes to Egypt, when Isaac goes to Egypt, there's a little bit of trouble. Then Joseph ends up in Egypt, ends up ascending to power in Egypt, but starts some somewhat questionable policies. Eventually, the Hebrews continue to flourish and prosper and grow to where the Pharaoh, as many politicians he is threatened by the growth of this, what had become a minority of people, have grown into a majority of people. And so we saw repetitiously he put them to work and then decreed that the sons would be put to death. Any male children born were to be put to death. At the conclusion there, the Hebrew women kept having children before the midwives could arrive and fulfill the task of putting these Hebrew sons to death. So we reached chapter number 2, and at that point Pharaoh had determined that it wasn't going to be as quiet anymore, that it was a direct mandate, that it wasn't the midwives that were to come and somehow secretly do this. It was going to be the law of the land. No Hebrews were to keep male children. However, once more, and interestingly, and this is something worth considering throughout Exodus, as we will get there in due course, but it's the women here that are the early heroes of the story. There was a woman, we're not given her name at this point. However, she has the child, whom we know to be Moses. She hides him 3 months. She's no longer able to hide him. Here she is in her own way. She's resistant to the imperial powers of her day by keeping this child in secret. Eventually, she has to take a risk, and she puts the child in a makeshift cargo basket, and to see what will occur once she puts him afloat in the Nile. The rest of the male children were to be put to death through drowning in the Nile. And now here is this opportunity for the child to be delivered via the Nile. Again, that's another robust feature that we'll be reminded of as we continue to read in the chapters to come. And here, this river is God's creation, is going to play a role in the rescue of this child, to where, as most of you, all of you likely know the story, Pharaoh's own daughter comes and hears the child crying, solicits the child, and wants to adopt it and make him her own child. And when they need somebody to nurse the child and take care of the child, here the mother of Moses is not only able to take care of her own son, but she is set up to receive wages for taking care of her own son, and receives benefits, no doubt, and some luxury from Pharaoh's household in order to do so. So here is the great irony. And throughout Genesis and Exodus, there's always an irony when God's servants are in Egypt. The leaders and rulers of Egypt try to do something that is unbecoming, something that is unethical, and here the God's heroes end up benefiting when the Pharaoh, the imperial ruler, attempts to do otherwise. So then it fast forwards. Moses has grown up, but he is observing, verse 11, all the hard labor of his people. Remember back in chapter 1, it was repetitiously echoed how hard Pharaoh was working them. He grows concerned, Moses does, especially when he sees one of the taskmasters that is taken advantage of, attacking one of his own Hebrew people. Again, here is a sign of the ruler, Pharaoh, and his henchmen, as it were, exploiting and taking advantage of the people. Moses, in an effort to defend his people, attacks the Egyptian, kills him, conceals the body. And the next day, there were two Hebrews arguing, and there Moses tries to intervene, and they ask him, verse 14, who made you a ruler or a judge over us? And they said, we saw what you did to the Egyptian. Are you going to do the same to us? And there Moses goes and flees, concerned that he might be accused of or guilty of murder. Interestingly, this verse, number 14, is used in Acts chapter 7 in Stephen's speech with regard to Jesus being rejected by his own people as he's attempting to mediate and advocate for his people, kind of like Moses and when he was trying to advocate and mediate between his people, yet Moses was rejected and Jesus was rejected. And so as Moses flees, he goes to the land of Midian, and there this priest of Midian who had 7 daughters, his daughters were put at threat by some shepherds, and Moses defended them. Moses continuing to be a defender of people, the Hebrews, and now these vulnerable daughters of the priest of Midian to these shepherds, and they take him, introduce him to their father, have him eat with them, and wouldn't you know that then Moses marries one of the daughters. And so for God's people to receive their rescue, here, interestingly, Moses is going to marry, he's raised outside of his people. He's going to marry outside of his people. And then in verse number 22, Moses affirms, I have become a resident foreigner, or resident alien, in a foreign land. Again, as I was remarking in chapter number 1, it's very important to pick up on the repetition of certain language. The people were overworked, and that's going to be important when the law of Moses ends up having a provision for a cessation of work, a Sabbath rest of work. And then here, as he affirms himself to be a resident alien in a foreign land, that comes into play because the law of Moses ends up containing special provisions for resident aliens who are dwelling with the people of Israel. And so at the conclusion of this chapter, verse 23, in that long period of time, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned because of the slave labor. They cried out, it says, their desperate cry because of their slave labor, it went up to God. Again, there is this echo, this repetition of how hard they're working, and the narrative begins to adjust as now, if this were a playwright, the curtain would go down. The second scene has ended in verse 24. When God hears their groaning, he remembers his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God sees his people, verse 25, and God understands. And so here, these first 2 chapters deliver something of a preamble, a preface to the story, but it's not merely an introduction. It's a common introduction. Here within these first 2 chapters, this first 5% of Exodus, there are these robust features that come into play that we will continue to lean on as we continue this study. All right, that's 10 minutes in now. I will call this video to a stop. Thank you for joining with me, and I will meet you again tomorrow as we consider chapter 3.